Hello there and welcome to another video. As I currently slave away at the Aerith vs Tifa video, I thought why not spend some time on another topic. Something which has been spoken about a lot, but not to the extent of the shipping wars or whether or not Vincent is Sephiroth's father. This is a different video. This is the idea that Jenova is the true main villain of Final Fantasy VII. Now sure, Sephiroth may be cool and all, but is he actually the main villain? After all, everything he does is for Jenova, and then saying that, Jenova does mostly do nothing but sit inside a tube the whole story, so how can someone be inactive be the main villain? Hopefully in this theory-esque video, I'll be able to establish some reasons why it's plausible that Jenova is the true main villain of the story and not Sephiroth. A bit of a warning before we begin is this video will have some spoilers for the upcoming Aerith vs Tifa video, as well as some points that I'll make in reference to the points I'll make in that video. Not only that, but I will also be mentioning Rebirth a few times, and of course Rebirth is a very recent release, so just warning you in case of spoilers, but there's not really much to talk about when it comes to Rebirth. So before we begin, what is Jenova and what's a summary of what she does in the story? In essence, Jenova is an alien that came crashing down to Gaia, creating the North Crater where she was discovered by the ancients known as the Cetra. The Cetra, however, started to die off as Jenova genetically annihilated the Cetra with her spores and turning many others who survived into monsters. Thousands of years later, Jenova is rediscovered by Shinra, who in case it began to do experiments on her, taking her DNA and cells and using it to their advantage. One such advantage was experimenting on Sephiroth as he was developing a fetus, but this would prove to be disastrous for obvious reasons. By essentially mixing the DNA of Jenova and the unborn Sephiroth, years later Sephiroth began to have a connection with Jenova, and as we all know, he would go on a rampage and declare his undying loyalty to his so-called quote-unquote mother. Throughout the story, Jenova is relatively passive, with significant moments being when Cloud, Barret and Tifa go off to rescue Aerith from Shinra HQ and discover Jenova in one of the chambers. She later appears as a boss throughout the original game, seemingly getting more powerful and changing form. She also does this in the remake and also the Rebirth, and often appearing in significant moments like in Aerith's death or in the finale of the game. Whilst Jenova was defeated alongside Sephiroth, Jenova somewhat survives as she ends up infecting thousands with her Jenova spores, creating a virus known as Geostigma. Jenova's remains also survive being inside a box, but despite everything, she is and her virus is basically destroyed by Aerith, curing everybody from the heavens at the end of Advent Children. But according to the devs, there's actually a possibility that Jenova may have actually be alive after all of that. In Remake and Rebirth, she plays mostly the same role, a passive background villain. However, Sephiroth actively hunts after her and resurrects her in a way. Cloud also calls Jenova quote-unquote mother as a result of being another Sephiroth clone, or at least being experimented to become one. Obviously that all failed. And it is no coincidence that Jenova appears more powerful than ever once the last Cetra, Aerith, dies in both the original and, spoiler alert, Rebirth. Hell, in Rebirth she is a gigantic monstrosity that requires everyone's input to beat her. And even then she basically gets away more or less. So that's a very basic and quick summary of Jenova, and to be fair, she is mostly passive in the series, so why do some people claim that she is the main villain, she is the true villain, when she does very little throughout and Sephiroth does most of the work? Well, here is a big reason why. If it weren't for Jenova, almost nothing in the story would have happened. Now, let's discuss something that I'm going to be mentioning in my Aerith vs Tifa video, and spoiler alert, it's the rule of 3. Every Final Fantasy game has a rule of 3 in terms of characters. There's always a main hero, a main heroine, and a main villain. In my Aerith vs Tifa video, I'll be mentioning how Cloud is obviously the main hero, with Aerith being the main heroine. I mean, the devs have already confirmed this as far back as 1997, and, well, if you're a Tifa fan, I'm sorry, she's not the main heroine. And in this rule of 3, I mentioned how integral these characters are to the story. So, for example, I mention if you remove Aerith from the story, it completely falls apart. But if you were to remove Tifa from the story, well, you can still work with the story with Tifa being replaced by another character. Take the War Market, for example. You'd replace Tifa with Jessie and everything would still work. The backstory in Nibelheim could literally be anyone, and the Under the Highwind scene could literally be swapped out with a very much alive and well Aerith. Basically, things wouldn't be different if you removed Tifa from the game and replaced her with another character. Whereas with Aerith, you need to have that character in because Aerith is vital to the story. She is also the main girl because she basically saves the day not just once, but twice in the story overall. Basically, any character, not just Tifa, but Yuffie, Barrett, Red, etc., they're not necessarily massively important to the main overarching story, whereas Cloud and Aerith are 100% important. So what about the villain? It's Sephiroth, right? Well, this is where things could get controversial. You see, I mentioned replacing Tifa is very easy, but with Aerith you can't get rid of her whatsoever. She is vital to the story. Well, one could argue the same is for Sephiroth, and the game's series itself actually points this out, with the fact of the Sephiroths that we see, and the remnants being nothing more than clones all doing Jenova's bidding. Simply put, without Sephiroth, anyone could replace him, even Cloud himself. But you can't replace Jenova, because Jenova is actually a lifeline for the whole story. Let me explain. Jenova is basically responsible for everything that happens, and here are some major points as to how vital she is within the story. Without Jenova, Hojo would never have experimented on the unborn Sephiroth, and practically mutated him. In fact, Hojo most likely would never have been as sadistic or as evil without his overly obsessive behaviour around Jenova. It's even possible that Hojo may have just been an average Joe, or may have just been random scientist number 105, rather than the vile human being that he is in the final product. Without Jenova, there's a chance that Shinra would never have become as powerful as it did, thus much of the events would never have taken place. Sure, they probably would have wanted to find this promised lands, but if the Cetra were thriving and alive because Jenova never existed, then what do Shinra actually have as a motivation? Because they have plenty of people to ask, and maybe the promised lands would be easier to obtain as a result. In fact, many of their experiments and weaponry was most likely developed with Jenova's DNA in mind, which means that without Jenova, they really don't have as much power as they could have. Quite obviously, without Jenova, Sephiroth would never have gone insane, slaughtered Nibelheim, or attempted to end the world. Hell, if it wasn't for Jenova, Sephiroth probably wouldn't have become as powerful as he was. He'd probably be very average in Soldier. He'd probably be a very average human being with a normal life, a normal family, etc, etc. Without Jenova, Aerith would never have died. It was her existence and knowing that Aerith was a threat to her ultimate plans that resulted in her trying to get Cloud and then ultimately getting Sephiroth to kill Aerith. In both Original and Rebirth, Jenova appears soon after Aerith's death in one of her most powerful physical forms, as if to hint that Jenova is technically the one that murdered Aerith, or was the one that instructed the killing of Aerith. Without Jenova, Cloud would never have become corrupted. Whilst many do claim that Sephiroth is the one that's controlling Cloud when he snatches the black materia or is about to kill Aerith, the truth is it's more Jenova who's in control. Her cells allows her to control her victims, whether it's like a biological weapon like with Geostigma, or essentially through some sort of mind control, which is almost certain that it was Jenova, not Sephiroth, who was controlling Cloud during these odd and aggressive moments that he had. And finally, without Jenova, millions would still be alive. The Ancients, aka the Cetra, would still be thriving. Pretty much all the victims of Midgar, Wutai, or pretty much everywhere else in the world would be alive and well if it wasn't for Jenova and her ultimate plans. As you can see, without Jenova, pretty much a majority of the game and the story as a whole would never have happened. Jenova may be a passive villain, but she is integral to the entire story. In fact, I bet if Sephiroth had succeeded in his plans, Jenova would have gotten rid of him almost immediately, because let's be real, Sephiroth was nothing more than a minion for her. I guess one way to look at Jenova is like Sauron from The Lord of the Rings. Sauron is the main antagonist, no one is arguing about that, yet he remains passive and doesn't do all that much in terms of action. Rather, it's Sauron's minions who do all the handiwork. And this is just like Jenova and Sephiroth. Jenova sits back and commands the actions of Sephiroth, who does pretty much all the action. Pretty much, Jenova is the puppeteer and Sephiroth is the puppet. Now sure, we can all say for sure that Sephiroth is the main villain, after all that's basically what the devs say, and that's basically how most would see it, but the argument that Jenova can be considered the true main villain is something that one can certainly see, especially given the context that she plays a massive role in the story despite her passiveness. She is 100% vital to the story, and without her, ironically, the story would never be. Her involvement influences all the other villains in some ways. Her actions affect everyone, the heroes, the ordinary citizens, and anything else in between. She affects everything in the story. Overall, I think an argument can be said that Jenova is the true main villain, as I mentioned above. Obviously, using the rule of free logic and the idea that one character is vital to the story whereas other characters are not is something that could be used to examine Jenova and Sephiroth as two characters. Technically speaking, Jenova is arguably the true main villain because she is vital, whereas Sephiroth arguably is not so vital. He can be replaceable. I mean, there's a reason why there's Sephiroth clones, for example. But at the end of the day, this is all up to your interpretation. Hope you enjoyed this very short short theory video, and hopefully the Aerith vs Tifa video won't take too much longer to script, because my god, having to go through everything in Rebirth is taking a long time, especially because it came out while I was doing the script. Anyways, I'll see you next time.